Today is July 29th, 2015. I am joined in the Billings Gazette studios by Bob Sorensen. Bob lives in Billings, and Bob, thank you for coming in and sharing your Vietnam story today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's a privilege.
Oh, let's start at the beginning. That's usually a good place for an interview. Tell me a little bit about your life. Let's go before Vietnam, just to give people a little bit of background about who you are.
Sure. Well, I was born in Billings and raised here on the West End near Burlington Park. It was an idyllic time and place to grow up. Great memories of growing up, Little League Baseball, Boy Scouts, shooting in the Yellowstone Rifle Club. Went on to Billings West High, was an honor student there, a student leader, and ended up getting a scholarship to Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Had big visions of my future at that point in time, and traveled out to New York. Along with Cornell, there was another event in our family that was concurrent that ended up being a significant factor in those times for me, and that was our family moved to Northern California, to the San Francisco Bay Area, while I was just starting school. So quite a big change for me to be attending school on the West Coast or East Coast and having my parents live on the West Coast. And then the times and events in those two locations were really factors in leading me to the path that ended up in Vietnam.
Can you say more about what was the fact? Describe those two places, Ithaca, New York, and then the Bay Area. It seems like those are two. Those would be two interesting places to be around 1969.
They sure were. Cornell in Ithaca is an incredibly beautiful place, but it was also ground zero for the anti-war movement, for emerging racial tensions. And the very first day that I lived in my dormitory at Cornell, I received a knock on my dormitory room. It was a wild-haired, amped-up young man recruiting new students to join the anti-war movement. And I was quite taken aback by that, and little did I know at that point in time how serious the anti-war movement was on the Cornell campus. In California, in the Bay Area especially, you had the counterculture of the hippies and Berkeley and Telegraph Avenue, just half an hour from where my parents lived. The racial tension with the Black Panthers, and the anti-war movement, which I ended up having some up-close and personal experience with when I was drafted.
Well, so the question is, and those were two ground zeros of anti-war movement, and then your experience is you go to not long after you go to Vietnam. How did that work? Tell me about that.
Right. The time at Cornell was quite challenging for me. The culture in the campus was a difficult distraction to deal with and try to be a student as well.
What were you studying?
I was studying chemistry.
Okay.
I wanted to be a chemist and do research chemistry.
Okay.
The end of the story really is that I had a difficult time, and I needed to, after 2 years at Cornell, I needed to take a break and recalibrate on what I really wanted to do. So I left school for, at the time, was on a temporary basis. Went to California to live with my parents and get a job for the summer. And the long arm of the Yellowstone County Selective Service didn't take long to find me. It just took 2 months.
Wow.
And
you're in the Bay Area, and they still found you.
I was in the Bay Area, and they found me. I remember clearly receiving the letter from the Selective Service Board here in Billings. There was kind of a iconic leader of that organization. Her name was Mrs. Ward. And when I opened the letter and saw her name, I instantly knew what was in for. And my mother was standing next to me when I opened the draft letter, and I uttered an expletive that I never had used in her presence, the one and only time that's ever occurred in my life. And then it was, a short wait. I was bused to the Oakland Induction Center, and it was a very, very chaotic experience. The anti-war protesters were on the bus the next couple of blocks before we arrived at the center, banging on the sides of the bus. There was just a mass demonstration at the exit of the bus to try to navigate through to get into the induction center. And some of the fellows that were on the bus actually took up the protesters' request to not go in. And from there, I did go in. I went through the induction procedure, and in short order was in Fort Lewis, Washington for basic training.
So can we go back to those moments? What do you remember? You step on this bus to go to the induction center, and you're met by protesters. What do you remember? What are the memories? What are the sights and sounds of that? What does that look like?
The sounds were just loud slogans and chanting. They had all kinds of signs, and they were fairly up in your face.
Mm-hmm. Did you sympathize with their position at all?
Not at all at the time.
Okay. Were you afraid? Was that a scary experience? I mean, it's one thing not only to go to an induction center, but then to be met by protesters.
Yes. To be honest, it was more deer in the headlights. Didn't really have a feel for where I was, what I was going through until I looked back on it.
What did you think of the people who agreed with their slogans and refused to go into the induction center? Was that a scary thing? Was that chaotic? Tell me about what that was like.
Well, I was shocked that could happen. I knew that the way I was brought up here in Billings, that I was accountable for my actions, that by virtue of being drafted, I had some responsibility that I had to follow through with, and there just was no room in my decision-making to do otherwise.
Right. When you got that letter, and it was kind of there, I imagine that's one of those seminal moments in your life, and you got it and you read it. What were some of the thoughts that went through your head?
Well, the expletive,
right, of course,
pretty much zeroes in on it, and it was shocking in that, given the growing up in Billings, the academic success that I enjoyed in Billings, not so much in Cornell, it was really a reflection of how did I end up at this point.
Yeah. Had you had any siblings, family members who had fought in wartime or had been in the armed service?
I did. I had an uncle named Robert Parker, and I'm named for him, who served in World War II. He was drafted from Weevil County, Montana, spent 2.5 years training for the invasion of France, and went to France shortly after D-Day. It was in the overall organization of the 3rd Army, Patton's Army. He fought with the 5th Armored Infantry Division. Went through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, liberated cities in those countries, and was killed in action on the German border in September of 1944.
So that name has a military history.
It does for me.
Yeah. So you go to Fort Lewis. You're a guy from Montana via the Bay Area through California, kind of through New York, and now you're in Washington. Tell me where does the story go from Fort Lewis?
Well, the time of year was early fall, September and October at Fort Lewis. Basic training was a bit of a blur. The strong memory that I have were the drill sergeants who had all served multiple tours in Vietnam, and the treatment that the drill sergeants gave to the recruits, to the draftees, was pretty miserable. But actually the training itself was, I wouldn't say easy, but it was not problematic. Physical side of it, training side of it. But that resulted in me getting an assignment once you complete basic training to go to combat medic training in Fort Sam Houston, Texas.
So you, how does that, I imagine that there's a lot of training for that. How much longer does that take to go?
That training, it's the Army's advanced training before you're actually assigned to an regular Army unit. And for the medic training, it was about 10 weeks. And that was in late fall in November, December of 1969. I remember it was my first visit to Texas. The heat and humidity were quite a shock to me. Ironically, in the training platoon that I served in, there were 4 Montanans in my platoon, and we all bunked within a few feet of each other. And the memory I have, the most strong memory I have there is one bunk over was a young man, Anthony Snowbrick from Clyde Park, Montana. He was 18 years old, just out of high school. He was not drafted, he enlisted. And to put it bluntly, he was a naive kid. I wondered at the time what he was doing there. But he was so excited about his future in the Army, and he wanted to be a combat medic and fly on a dust-off helicopter. At 18 years old, he had that vision. I want to jump ahead 2 years. Anton Schnobrick lost his life in Vietnam in October of 1971 when his dust-off helicopter crashed on a nighttime mission in bad weather. And when I learned of that, I was already home from Vietnam a few months. When I learned of that, it devastated me because all I could remember was this 18-year-old that wanted to be a dust-off medic, and in 2 years' time, he lost his life. And it was a seminal moment for me in just trying to wrap my head around the cost of being engaged in Vietnam, just one little slice of that cost.
Tell me a little bit about, for people who may not be familiar with dust-off medic, what does that mean?
Dust-offs were the medical evacuation helicopters. It was kind of the elite group of the combat medic corps.
So you were a combat medic. What did that, let's talk a little bit about what that entailed.
Well, that's a very interesting story because it was a short story. I celebrated my 25th birthday with my father in San Francisco. He took me to lunch, and we had lunch and cocktails. It was my 21st birthday. And I was due to leave for Vietnam in about a week. And it was a time of very close reflection between my father and I, what the future might hold. He was worried about me, of course, and I was not sure what I was getting into. When I arrived in Vietnam and ended up being assigned to my unit, which was the 6th Battalion of the 14th Field Artillery in Pleiku, my first meeting was with the S3 operations officer, who was Major Rex Weaver. Major Weaver had looked at my file upon arrival at the unit and informed me that Effective immediately, I was no longer a combat medic, that he was going to assign me to a group that he supervised, commanded, in field artillery fire direction control. I had no training in that field.
Why you? Why did they decide that that's what you're going to do? Did you ever get an explanation?
Yes. He had a manpower balance to handle in an area where he needed a resource, and he didn't need a resource as a combat medic. So he simply made a business decision. How it affected me is all that training was put on the shelf, and I had to launch into on the job training, hands-on training in the new field. Most of the fellows that I worked alongside in my tour of duty in Vietnam had gone through field artillery school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and which is quite technical. So it was a very steep learning curve for me. And in looking back, monumental event in my Army career, because had I been assigned to a field unit, my exposure would have been significantly increased to what it was in the end for me. Who knows? I know this, that in some time at one of the fire bases, I roomed with the battery medic at a fire base called the Oasis. It was Alpha Battery of 6th Battalion, 14th Field Artillery. 2 weeks later, after I'd left that unit on some temporary duty as a field artillery fire direction control technician, the fire base was attacked by sappers. One of the sappers went up to the hooch that I had shared with the battery medic. The battery medic came out the door of the hooch, and he was shot point blank and killed. Just an example of what my path could have been.
Yeah. What is that? How often does that come into your thoughts?
I would say time definitely comes into play. It was in my thoughts for a number of years. I struggled with it, especially Anton Snowbridge. The death of the medic in the battery in my battalion, I was able to reconcile as, it was just the business of war. Somehow Anton's death affected me much more deeply.
Yeah, yeah. So you were field artillery, fire direction. So that meant that you had a lot of on-the-job training then if you had not went to school in that. Tell me about how that training went, and then also a little bit about what that job entailed. What's the daily kind of routine?
Well, the on-the-job training was fairly easy because of the mentors that I had. Fortunately, the unit that I was assigned to had some great mentors, and all of them were draftees. And this is one thing that's significant about Vietnam, is how you could take a fellow off the street in Billings, Montana, and plug him into a military organization, get them trained up to do their job, and to witness them doing their job effectively in a place that they really didn't want to be in, but they did the job and did it well. So I attribute my success in the on-the-job training to the mentors I had. One of them is still a very close friend to this day. There was another fellow that went through the process the same time I did, although he was a trained fire direction control technician, and I maintain a very close relationship with him We learned together.
Yeah. What do you learn how to do when you're? I mean, I can intuit from the title, field artillery. I get that, but what specifically? What are the jobs of someone who works in that world?
Maybe just a little bit of an overview. The 6th Battalion that I was assigned to had 3 batteries, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, and they were dispersed. Alpha was in south of Pleiku, Bravo was north of Khartoum and Ben Het, which became a legendary battlefield, and Charlie Battery was in Khartoum itself. Each battery had 2 175 millimeter guns, self-propelled, and 2 8-inch howitzers, self-propelled. The projectile for the 175 millimeter gun was 175 pounds. The range of the gun was 40 kilometers max, which round about 20 miles reach. The 8-inch howitzer had a range of 15 to 25 kilometers, round numbers 9 to 12 miles. And that comes into play on how these weapons were used. I want to jump back just a moment and just focus on my very first day with the battery. Major Weaver oriented me to my job, and along with that, the very first thing that was discussed is that we're going to have fire missions over the fence, over the border, Laos. And to be very clear, his instruction to me was, we are not in Laos. And if you look back in the history of Vietnam, that became a very significant piece of Vietnam War history. We had operations in Cambodia and Laos by special forces that the politically correct characterization at the time was we weren't operating there. So we were informed that not to discuss it with family or friends, never to write about it. We had our periodic phone calls back home, never to say anything about it. So that was an interesting piece that went along with the very...
Does that make, knowing that may not have been reported, or I assume that no matter what in war, there are certain things that are secret that you don't necessarily broadcast or transmit back, but did that make you feel uneasy?
It did, because the political context at the time was that we had rules of engagement that were prescribed and the American public was aware of, and that was not one of them that was disclosed. And it could have made a difference in the reaction of the American public to how the Vietnam War evolved.
Right. And so you were significantly behind, I mean, miles behind the fence, so to speak. Not I don't want to say you weren't vulnerable, but you weren't necessarily right on that line. You were back.
That's correct. Over the fence, we had Special Forces operations, the Green Berets, and a very elite subset of that that was run out of Khartoum province called the Command and Control Central. They would be equivalent to our SEALs these days. There were SEALs in Vietnam, but this was a subset of the Green Berets. And they were doing patrols and interdiction of North Vietnamese forces on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail fed over the mountain range where I was in Khartoum into South Vietnam. So the location I was based at in Khartoum was at a feeder point for the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the country of South Vietnam. So there was always presence of North Vietnamese regular army and Viet Cong elements in the immediate area. The fire missions that we had over the fence were conducted to support the Special Forces operations, and were also just to harass and interdict the traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Sure. What's an average day? What do you remember about an average day over there? Because I think we think of time in some somewhat truncated form. Oh, you spent, months, weeks, years, but what's just an average day like?
Well, to start with, might be interesting to reflect on the seasons in Vietnam. It's a Southeast Asian country, kind of in the tropical zone. And so monsoon season was about half the year, and the rest of the year was either cool or kind of Indian summer-like we experience here in Montana. So the monsoon season dictated a lot of what we did. A typical day for me is I lived in a wood frame hooch with galvanized tin roofing with about 10 other soldiers. And we operated out of a tactical operations center that was built by the Japanese in World War II in the 1940s. It was a cement bunker. And that was on a base that was supported by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. So Major Weaver's group, about a dozen of us, worked in this tactical operations center. We coordinated the artillery fires for all 3 of the 6 battalions' fire bases. Some fire bases operated by other Army units and coordinated with the ARVN artillery so that everyone was on the same page where the artillery was being directed so they could be out of harm's way. And one of the other responsibilities we had were to keep the air operations informed of our artillery fire so that we didn't expose them to harm. And that was a very exciting piece of the job because I got to talk to B-52 pilots, all the helicopter pilots, the gunship pilots, the Spookies and the Spectre pilots. And that was an interesting part of my job because it gave you a very close feel for what was going on when things were hot and heavy.
Right. Tell me, someone who we recently interviewed from Vietnam was talking about, kind of described it as these long periods of monotony punctuated by short moments of terror. And he said one of the hardest things for him to overcome was just the boredom. There wasn't a lot to do, and you were there. Is that daily life? Is that an accurate statement?
I think it's accurate for a lot of soldiers in Vietnam. It wasn't the case for me.
Okay, why?
Major Weaver always kept us busy. There was very little boredom, and when you did have free time, the way I used the time was to read or listen to music or write letters home. I wrote a lot of letters home. So I never really experienced periods of boredom. Your suggestion that long periods of boredom, short periods of terror is accurate generally, because our daily activities would go on for days on end, and then we'd get a rocket attack from a ridge just above the tactical operations center that we operated from, and probably in the 14 months that I served in that spot, it was pretty typical to get rocket attacks a couple of times a week. Some of them were almost direct hits. And if you look back, by the grace of God,
right,
you're not on the Vietnam Wall.
Yeah. Was that when those things did happen? How did you kind of keep sanity? If you're always under fire, sometimes several times a week, how do you keep it together?
The short answer is you just have to cope. The rocket attacks were certainly designed to mess with you. By the time of day, often it was at mealtime or just after you had gone to bed. I really have to hand it to the Viet Cong and NVA soldiers that were responsible for those rocket attacks, because not only the logistics of lugging the material by hand, which they did, but very crude weapons. They were incredibly smart, incredibly accurate, and incredibly, just from the psychology standpoint, incredibly point on with how they could mess with you.
What did you read, or what music did you listen to? I mean, was that a little bit of a home or normalcy, or what do you remember from that period as far as reading and listening to?
Well, I actually had the opportunity through the post-exchange system in the Army to order a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I set that up in my hooch, and I was into all the 1960s music. The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, all of that. So I would listen to
that. Is there one particular song that either you associate when you hear it, either that brings you back to that, or you think that helped get me through that was a personal anthem for me?
Well, my personal anthem, starting at Cornell and it continued through Vietnam, was The Doors' "Light My Fire." It was just a anthem song for me.
Right. When you were over in Vietnam, what did you miss about home? And where was home at that point? Because your parents were in California, you'd been to New York, Montana.
I think certainly family, but more than that, it was my network of friends. And I'd like to circle back to that because when we look back on my time in Vietnam, my circle of friends changed, and that was something that I've spent a good bit of time reflecting on.
How did they change?
When I returned from Vietnam, my parents by that time had moved back to Montana. They'd been in California 2 years. And when I was discharged, I came home to Billings. My intention, it was May of 1971, my intention was to get a summer job and enroll at the University of Montana, continue my college. So all of that played out. I arrived at University of Montana, and I had some good friends from my high school class there. And among them, what I experienced was a good bit of ambivalence about the fact that I had served in Vietnam. And it just seemed that close relationships that I had with friends, both male and female, in high school, kind of died on the vine. I did have a couple loyal friends that have stuck with me to this day, and I've certainly made new ones, and to their credit, the new friends I've made have a good respect for the fact that I served in Vietnam and often acknowledge it.
What do you think your friends or family would say, or excuse me, not what, but how do you think friends or family would say your experience in Vietnam changed you, and then how would you say it changed you?
Actually, I don't think it changed me that much. I look back on it, and I'm very proud at this point in my life that I did serve. It wasn't a path that I would have chosen to go down, but circumstances placed me there. I have no regrets. I'm proud to have served. And I think the group that I served in made a difference.
What was the hardest thing for you about serving in Vietnam?
I think the hardest thing I had to reconcile with was how I got to that point and how it changed the path that I was on when I enrolled at Cornell.
When you came back and you look back on that time, right after you got out, how did you feel about the, you're back in Montana, you're taking courses at the University of Montana. How does it feel to go from Vietnam back to a college setting? How did that work with you?
It was a bit surreal to begin with. I also had my youngest sibling, my brother, was also there at the time, just starting as a freshman. And he got involved in the anti-war movement, and there was a bit of a disconnect there,
right,
for me. Looking back, he now looks back on that and regrets some of the way that played out at that point in time, and we have no issues at this point.
Right. Has your understanding, not necessarily you yourself, have changed? How has the Vietnam as a historical event, something that you happen to live very personally, has it changed, or how you look back on it? How does a Vietnam vet look back on that war now? Now almost, it's 50 years ago in May, or this May, that we committed U.S. combat troops. We had advisors there before, but how does that now, with a little bit of history in between, how do you look at that?
Well, I find the history very interesting, going all the way back to World War II and the French occupation of Vietnam. The thing that is most significant to me is there were many, many predictors of the failure that was imminent in the United States engagement in Vietnam. One of the great books that I would recommend is Streets Without Joy by Bernard Fall, who was a journalist, who ultimately was killed in Vietnam in 1967. And in it, Bernard Fall describes the lack of understanding that the French had for the Vietnam culture and history. They had been under threat of conquest by China for about 1,000 years. And the Vietnam people's history is that they resisted that successfully for centuries. And the learning from Fall's book, and then subsequently a book written in 1972 by Francis Fitzgerald called Fire in the Lake, gave a more contemporary point of view on the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and it was very close to the same message that Fall gave. Didn't understand the culture, didn't really understand that our vision of democracy and freedom for that people was a disconnect, given their history and culture. So I look back on that with a lot of personal regret that we could have done a lot better. Where that plays out and where it really is sad is, when we think about Iraq and Afghanistan, it is just so similar.
Is that hard to see? I mean, because you lived it and you saw the price in Vietnam, is it hard? Is it like reliving history again?
It really is. The Vietnam War, the meat of it was 10 years long, 58,000 killed in action on the Vietnam Wall. Iraq, I would argue that similar to Vietnam, we did not understand their culture and history. Our basis for being there was skewed, and we didn't figure that out when it was should have been pretty evident over a period of time. And in Iraq and Afghanistan especially, another 10-year cycle. And where are we? Although the cost in life for the United States was significantly lower than Vietnam, the impact to both of those countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, is massive.
Yeah. When you came home, you were an interesting interesting case, because a lot of people who were drafted and sent out of Montana probably didn't have people protesting their bus. You did. What was your return to the United States like? How was that welcome back?
Well, the welcome back was limited to my immediate family. Mm-hmm. I flew from Fort Lewis, Washington, over the Cascades, snow-covered mountains, and I'm a mountain lover. I've spent a good bit of my life in the mountains around the world. And looking out of the plane window seat down at the Cascades, it was a strong message to me that I was finally home.
Yeah.
I arrived at the Billings airport. My parents picked me up. They had just moved back into their house in Billings from their transfer back from California. And they had done some remodeling, so the house looked different. To be honest with you, there wasn't much said.
Right.
And it was just kind of get back to normal life. That was the expectation of my parents. And I tried my best to be accountable for that.
Was it hard to get back to normal life?
It was a little bit, because my close friends from college were just finishing up or already finished up. I had a good friend at Columbia University in New York City who was just finishing up and was getting ready to go to medical school. And the other friends were just starting to arrive home from summer to either continue school or go on to their careers. And I still had a gap that I had to close.
You felt like kind of maybe left behind a little?
Right.
Like the life went on. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that probably may have been typical of a lot of veterans, and different ones handled it. Ultimately, how did you bridge that gap?
Just time and patience. I went on and I enjoyed the Missoula life. Gave me ample time to get out in the mountains.
Yeah.
Which helped a great deal. And had the opportunity to come back and work at the Billings Exxon refinery in the summer, and was given an opportunity for permanent employment there and accepted that, and went on to working there for 35 years and retired in 2009.
It's a good career. When people hear that you served in Vietnam, or when you talk about it, what are the things that they ask or say? What's kind of the common response to that? Or do they know?
Well, a typical question is, what was it like? Mm-hmm. And there's a different story and answer for that question for every soldier.
Yeah.
So, I haven't had a lot of interaction from friends or family about my Vietnam experience. So my story has pretty much been on the shelf all this time.
Are there certain things, sounds, sights, or training that still comes back to you almost instinctively? I'm not necessarily talking flashbacks, but I'm talking about, I had one veteran who told me, I never forgotten, every time I hear a helicopter, I have to look and check it out. It's just who I am. Are there things like that for you?
Well, certainly the sound of a helicopter. It just resonates immediately. I've traveled a good bit in Asia since Vietnam, and when I'm traveling in Asia, sounds and smells. One of the daily activities that we had was to handle the human waste, and that involved removing a barrel that was placed under the seat in the outhouse and saturating it with a mixture of diesel and gasoline and lighting it on fire. And that smell was pervasive in virtually every unit that wasn't out in the bush. So that smell is etched in my brain, and there haven't been too many triggers for that.
Thankfully, right?
Thank goodness, but certainly one etched in my brain. The food.
Tell me a little bit about the food.
The food was very marginal. I don't know what it would have been like to be assigned to be a cook, but limited resources to work with, and not much variety, pretty bland. The meat that was served was always called mystery meat. A lot of suggestions that it was the local water buffalo that an Army vehicle had struck.
Right.
The Army had to
pay for it.
But events like Thanksgiving, Christmas were always done very well. I have to tip my hat to the folks that pulled that off.
Right. Was it a lonely existence?
Not at all for me. The camaraderie that I had in my small group of a dozen soldiers, very close-knit guys, all different backgrounds, all over the country, and made the time go by quickly.
Was the fear of being wounded or dying because you're in a war zone and you've got guns, does that weigh in, or how does that work? For most of us, we can't imagine that kind of constant threat.
I think for me and for most, once you get there, you accept that reality, potential for that, but you become conditioned to do your job. The only times that I can say I was scared or frightened was in rocket attacks when there was almost a direct hit and you weren't sure. Took a few minutes to get your bearings as the dust is falling and things are shaking to assure yourself that you're still living, breathing, and what next.
Right. When you were there, were there certain things that you missed about home other than, I'm sure the creature comforts, but were there things about Montana, specifically about Billings, that you thought, I never realized that I would miss something like that?
Not so much for me, because I had been on this adventure to go out to New York and experience a whole new world when I entered college, and then had the opportunity to experience the San Francisco Bay Area in the 60s. So it was kind of like one big adventure, kind of a continuing adventure, and here I was in Vietnam, so I didn't spend a lot of time reflecting on missing home.
Have you been back to Vietnam since you were in Vietnam?
I have not. It's high on my wish list to go back, and I've had opportunities that just haven't worked out. But I do intend to visit Vietnam. I have acquaintances who have traveled back to the various spots where I served. So I've seen their photographs and videos. So I've had kind of a vicarious or virtual trip there. The one thing that is clear is that things have changed a lot. And, of course, there's this naive wish to go back and stand in the spot where you served. One of the things I did on a weekly basis when I had some free time, I climbed about 100-foot tall water tower, a concrete water tower with a tank on top. That was next to our base. And it was just outside the perimeter, and it had been built by the Japanese in the 1940s. during World War II. And for some reason, there was no restriction to going there. I just climbed up the ladder and got up on the top and had a catbird seat. Next door to our facility was a U.S. Helicopter base, Khartoum Air Base, that there was an aviation company there. They called themselves the Bikinis. So all of their logo art on their helicopters were gals in bikinis. And I'd watch them take off. I would take my writing materials with me to the climb up the top and write letters home. I had a great view of the mountain range just a couple of kilometers to the west of us. And, there were certain days when I watched the helicopters go off, maybe 10 in a group. And in some instances, only one or two would come back. And in some instances, retrieval helicopters would come back with damaged Huey helicopters suspended below them on a cable. And when I started to piece what was going on together through contacts that I had in my job, I would learn that it was generally Special Forces operations going on that were a lot of the Green Berets and the Special Ops guys in the Command and Control Central didn't come home.
That's tough. I mean, to learn that backstory.
One of the privileges I had is that the Green Berets were very friendly. They had a base B-24 that they operated out of in Khartoum. And on a weekly basis, they would invite us over on Saturday evenings for steaks and ice cream, which we had no access to. They did. And we became close friends. I had one sergeant friend in the Green Berets that if I wanted to go back to Pleiku, which is about a 40-kilometer drive from Khartoum, he would lend me his Jeep, and I could just go back if I wanted to hit the PX in Pleiku or something. Those guys' stories were phenomenal, all of them multiple tours in Vietnam, starting back in the early 1960s. The one common theme in sitting, having a beer with one of those guys was how dedicated they were to their profession, how much risk they took, and how dysfunctional their family lives were.
That's an interesting common theme. What's the, let's look at this video and hope that someone 50 years from now or later watches it. What do you hope, what would you say you want people to know about Vietnam or remember?
Well, it starts with the idea of good intentions, the United States trying to project freedom and democracy on a people that had a lot of hardship and adversity, and then just not having a plan, an effective plan and a strategy to get to the end point, or have an end point and be able to have a strategy and plan to get there. And I think that's played out in Iraq and Afghanistan, as I mentioned earlier. I want people to remember the incredible sacrifice that the 58,000 killed in action gave in support of our mission there. And then the couple million soldiers who served there and came back, in many cases, physically and mentally damaged. And then those fortunate like myself that didn't have those afflictions, who gave up a gap in their what might have been their progression.
Yep.
In their life.
Is there any, as we talked a little, war stories, war tends to get remade in movies and television, in song, and in literature. Do you think that there are any either portrayals on television or film that seem to say, when you watch that, say, yeah, that was what it's like, or that hit the mark more than some of this?
The one film that resonates with me is We Were Soldiers Once and Young, the story of Lieutenant General Harold Moore. I think the book was written in the 1990s, and a film was made shortly thereafter. What intrigues me with that story is it happened in a location just out the back door where I was in Vietnam. It was 1965, and it was really the first major battlefield in Vietnam with U.S. forces, the 7th Cavalry of the U.S. Army. Incredible, brutal combat, high loss, high casualties. And I thought that film portrayed that period of history and the consequences and cost very well. That's probably the film for me. I'm probably more interested in some of the literature of Vietnam. And I probably have a half a dozen books in a couple of categories that I really have a strong interest in. The first two would be Streets Without Joy by Bernard Fall, that covers the period from 1945 to the 1954 French exit from Vietnam. The second one would be Francis Fitzgerald's Fire in the Lake. I believe that was written in 1972. It kind of follows up with Bernard Fall on characterizing the mistakes that were made by the U.S. government in Vietnam. And the war was far from over in 1972, so there was still about 3 years left that we could have changed course, and we didn't. And then two books that are fantastic about telling the story of what it's like to be a combat soldier in Vietnam. Dispatches by Tim Herr, a journalist who was really the first journalist to put the words that you hear related to his book as visceral description of what it's like to be a combat GI. And then the second one would be The Things That Carried by Tim O'Brien, which is sort of an interesting combination of autobiography and fiction, in which the stories, it's a book of short stories that give incredible descriptions of what it's like to be on the ground as a combat GI. And then two other books, A Bright Shining Lie by Neil Shahan, which is very interesting to me because once again it was centered in the spot that I served in Kon Tum province. It was the life of John Paul Vann, who was a career soldier, a famous general in the Vietnam War. He was outed by the military, and then like a phoenix rose from the ashes, and as a civilian was hired by the Army to do damage control in 1972 in the Easter Offensive, which a ground zero point for that was Kon Tum province, and he lost his life there as a civilian general, basically, in a helicopter crash. And then the other book is a Rumor of War by Philip Caputo, which is another. Caputo was a lieutenant, platoon officer, and what's interesting about that book is he looks back on and reflects on his actions, what he would do differently if he had the privilege to do that. The literature of Vietnam is rich. I think those are the top few for me.
Why is it for you? Some people, and I understand that different people respond, react, and kind of reflect in different ways. Why for you has the literature, reading about it, been so particularly enriching, do you think?
Well, I think it starts with just my interest ever since being very young with history, with adventure, military history. Just seems to be an area of strong interest for me.
What have I missed? I mean, it's in some respects it's a little disingenuous to say, well, we're going to get all the experiences and all of your thoughts down in 1 hour. But tell me, are there some key things that I simply didn't get?
Well, there's one event I'd like to talk about a little bit, and that was in April of 1970, when one of our Special Forces bases north of Khartoum, where I served, was under siege. The location's name is Dak Siang. The Special Forces operated out of Dak Siang and advised and supported Arvin military. It was right on the Laotian border. And our Bravo battery and the 6th Battalion of the 14th Field Artillery provided fire support for the Special Forces when they were under siege. And that battle evolved over almost a couple of weeks. And I was moved up forward with Major Weaver and another soldier from my Tactical Operations Center to help coordinate the artillery fires and the air traffic control with artillery fire for that to try to end that siege. And while there, our forward artillery observer, Lieutenant George Tom Kelly III from North Carolina, was in the midst of the siege in its final days, and there was a rescue attempt made and several helicopters crashed. It was the first time in the Air Force history that they lost 2 Jolly Green Giant rescue helicopters in the same mission. Helicopter lands at Lieutenant Kelly's location, and he put the Arvin soldiers on board and another MACV advisor, and elected to stay behind because there wasn't any more room on the helicopter. And he was soon thereafter killed at point blank. Lieutenant Kelly was an interesting fellow. He wore love beads, wire rim glasses. He was 22 years old at the time and did not fit the out-of-the-box shake and bake lieutenant. He was a little bit of a rebel, but a great guy. And what played out in the late 1990s, one of the fellows that I served with wanted to reconnect with his buddies. He tracked me down, tracked others down, and about 2002, we all got together in San Antonio, Texas. And one of the invitees was Lieutenant Kelly's brother, Patrick. Patrick had put a website together in tribute to his brother, and I had learned about it and got exposed, but it was just an incredibly touching, moving experience to meet Patrick, and for Patrick to meet soldiers that knew his brother, especially those that knew him up to the time he died. That has played out to where that first gathering that we had after, over 20 years of being fairly disconnected, that's played out to where we're gathering at least every 2 years. We have a gathering planned for September of 2015 in Maine, where we're going to rent a house. The interesting sub-story to that is of the couples that were invited to get together in September. One of them is Rex Weaver, my commanding officer, who was a major then at age 34. I viewed him to be an incredible mentor, and if I were to hold up one or two men in my life that were the most influential, he would be number one.
Why? Tell me a little bit about why him.
Just the professional character he had, ability to set expectations, which included accountability, but in the context of total fairness, and led by example. I look back on him, I'm amazed that at age 34 he could have that influence on my life. I encountered someone similar, same age as Rex, in my Exxon career, department manager, who was very similar. But I hold Rex up as the most influential adult man in my life, neck and neck with my dad. And I only knew Rex for less than a year.
Right, yeah.
So that's pretty phenomenal. Anyway, Rex went on to, he was a career soldier, went on to retire as a brigadier general. And when my friend from Massachusetts started reconnecting us, and we got together with Rex for the first time, his wife informed us that he had not reconnected with anybody from his Vietnam service in all those years except the several enlisted guys that he commanded. So we've maintained an incredibly close friendship since then, and we've spent time on his little retirement ranch in Texas, and get together as often as we possibly can. He's in his late 70s now, and he is experiencing some of the physical damage from Vietnam with Agent Orange related diseases.
Right. That is a wonderful story. So in this war zone, you've developed some friendships that have lasted a lot long.
If I didn't make the point I was trying to make, it's think about a career Army officer who retires as brigadier general, selecting as his close circle of friends 4 or 5 specialist 4s or specialist 5s. That's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah. Speaks a lot to you, too. What else? Did I miss anything else?
I'd just like to say I've had numerous opportunities to visit the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. I think for anybody that hasn't had the opportunity and the privilege of visiting, I highly recommend that. It will definitely, you'll definitely walk away with some questions, some reflection on what it means. Just an incredible cost.
Yeah, $58,000.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Bob, I want to thank you for sharing your story. And most of all, I want to thank you for sharing your service and taking that gap out of your life. Thank you. Thank you for also helping us record this. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your service. Thank you.
Gerald, thank you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you.